dive into the deadliest pandemic in recorded history. The Black Death, 1300s, half of Europe, gone. No warning, no explanation, no cure. One day, a fever. Then the swellings, dark, painful, grotesque, spreading under the arms, along the neck. Within days, sometimes within hours, entire families were gone. Mothers, children, neighbors, priests. Church bells rang so constantly that cities stopped bothering to count the dead. Graveyards overflowed, streets went silent. And across an entire continent, one question echoed from every village, every city, every cathedral. Is this the end of the world? What no one understood, what no one could possibly understand, was that they were living through the deadliest pandemic in recorded human history. A catastrophe that would kill up to half of Europe's population. That would permanently crack the foundations of medieval civilization. This was the Black Death, and once it arrived, there was nowhere to run. To understand how completely this destroyed everything, you first need to understand what was lost. Because the early 14th century was not a dark, backwards era. Not even close. It was the peak of the High Middle Ages. A period of genuine optimism, explosive population growth, and global connection unlike anything Europe had seen since the fall of Rome. Thanks to a warming climate, what historians call the medieval warm period, harvests had been good for generations. Europe's population had nearly doubled in 2 centuries. Cities were bursting past their old Roman walls, Paris, Florence, Venice, London. These were loud, dense, chaotic, thriving places, packed with merchants, craftsmen, pilgrims, and ambition. Gothic cathedrals were rising toward the sky, symbols of a society that genuinely believed it was advancing, getting closer to God and closer to understanding the world. And the world was connected. A Venetian merchant could buy silk that had traveled the entire length of Asia, moving through trade networks protected by the Mongol Empire, what historians call the Pax Mongolica. Spices, gold, ideas, technology, all of it flowing across continents with a speed and efficiency the ancient world would have found unimaginable. It was a vibrant, bustling, optimistic civilization. But here's the thing about connection. It works in both directions. The same roads and ships that moved wealth were about to move something else entirely. The infrastructure for global catastrophe was already in place. This society, seemingly so robust, so confident, was about to meet an enemy it couldn't see, couldn't understand, and had absolutely no way to fight. The apocalypse began thousands of miles from the stone streets of Paris, out in the vast, windswept steppes of Central Asia, likely in the region of modern-day Kyrgyzstan or northern China, in a landscape of extreme cold, extreme heat, and endless grassland horizon. Here, a bacterium called Yersinia pestis had existed for millennia, living quietly in the burrowing rodent populations of the steppes, marmots, ground squirrels, cycling through animals and fleas in a relatively stable ecological balance, far from major human settlements, largely unknown. But in the 1330s, something shifted. Climate historians point to a period of severe ecological stress, drought followed by heavy rains, that devastated the rodent population's food sources. Starving, the infected animals migrated closer to human settlements, bringing their fleas with them. The leap from animal to human happened along the Silk Road trading outposts. The first victims probably didn't understand what was wrong. High fever, vomiting, and then the swellings. Agonizing, dark lumps in the lymph nodes, the buboes that gave the disease its name. News traveled slowly in the ancient world, but rumors of disaster moved faster than any caravan. By the early 1340s, terrifying fragmented reports were reaching Mediterranean ports. Merchants spoke of entire civilizations vanishing in the east, of pestilence that had emptied India, Tartary, Mesopotamia, of towns that had simply ceased to exist. Europeans listened with a mix of horror and detachment. Distant tragedies, exotic lands, divine punishment for foreign beliefs. They didn't worry. They had no concept of germ theory. They didn't realize that the spices flavoring their food had traveled the same road as the thing that was about to kill them. The geographical pivot point of this entire story is a city most people have never heard of. Caffa, on the Crimean Peninsula, jutting into the northern Black Sea. This was no ordinary town. Caffa was a fortified, enormously wealthy colony of the Republic of Genoa, the crucial hinge connecting the overland Asian trade routes to the maritime networks of the Mediterranean. Inside its massive stone walls, Italian merchants, Armenian traders, a cosmopolitan mix of peoples protected by Genoese crossbowmen. In 1346, Caffa was under siege. The army of the Golden Horde, a successor state of the Mongol Empire led by Khan Jani Beg, surrounded the city. The Genoese were masters of defense and maritime resupply. The siege dragged on for months, a brutal stalemate, and then, silently, the Black Death arrived in the Mongol camps. Soldiers living in close quarters with poor sanitation, the perfect breeding ground. Men began dying by the hundreds, then thousands, bodies turning dark before death. The besieging army wasn't being defeated by the enemy. It was being dissolved by biology. Watching his forces disintegrate, facing humiliation, Jani Beg made a decision that would echo through centuries. He ordered his plague-ridden soldiers loaded onto trebuchets, and for days, the sky over Caffa rained corpses. Think about that for a moment. The Genoese defenders watched in horror as pestilent bodies smashed onto rooftops into market squares. The psychological terror was immediate, but the biological impact was worse. The bacteria, carried in the fluids of the dead and in the fleas abandoning cold corpses for warm living hosts, had infiltrated the city. The unbreakable fortress had been breached from the inside. Panic swept through Caffa. The wealthy Genoese merchants understood one thing: the city was finished, and they had ships. 12 galleys loaded with refugees, cargo, and invisible stowaways slipped out of the harbor, past the dying Mongol army, and set sail for home. They passed through the Bosphorus. They passed Constantinople, which would soon be devastated itself, and they sailed into the Mediterranean, the economic engine of Europe, a zone of intense, fast-moving trade and human contact. The fleeing ships became vectors of death, docking at major ports to resupply, unknowingly seeding the infection at every stop, trading goods, exchanging crews, and leaving behind something no one could see. The first major European port to fall was Messina in Sicily. When the Genoese galleys arrived, dock workers rowed out to meet them. What they found was a scene from a nightmare. Contemporary chroniclers recorded it. Most of the sailors were dead, their bodies rotting on deck in the Mediterranean heat. The few survivors were delirious, barely conscious, covered in black boils dripping blood and pus. The port authorities of Messina ordered the ships expelled immediately. But it was already too late. The black rats that lived in the holds of every medieval ship and the fleas on their backs had used the mooring ropes to reach the docks before anyone gave the order. Messina was the test case for Europe, and Europe failed it completely. Within weeks, the social fabric of the city disintegrated. People fled to the countryside, spreading the contagion across Sicily. Word of the great pestilence spread to other ports, which tried to close their harbors. But medieval quarantine was a leaky sieve. A ship loaded with valuable spices could often bribe its way past a blockade. By early 1348, the great maritime republics were crumbling. Genoa, the home port of the ships from Caffa, was devastated. Venice faced an existential threat. The Venetians, practical as always, eventually invented the lazaretto, islands in the lagoon, where arriving ships had to wait 40 days before entering the city. 40 giorni, the origin of the word quarantine, a pioneering public health measure. But for the first wave, it was too little, too late. The gondolas of Venice became funeral barges, piling bodies high as they moved through silent canals. From Italy, the plague moved west to Marseille, the great gateway to France. It crossed the Adriatic to Dubrovnik. The coastal perimeter of Europe was breached. Now it turned inland, following river barges up the Rhone, following carts along ancient Roman roads, moving into the dense, beating heart of medieval Europe. And here's what you need to understand about cities in the 14th century. Paris, Florence, London, Barcelona. These were walled enclosures of winding, narrow alleys, multi-story timber buildings that blocked out the sun, open sewers running down the center of streets, people and animals living in intimate proximity. Vibrant, rich, energetic, and hygienically, they were tinderboxes. When the plague hit a major city, it didn't just kill people. It killed the city itself as a functioning organism. We have to understand the terror of facing this without modern medicine. The best medical minds of the 14th century, the doctors of the University of Paris, were completely baffled. Their framework wasn't germ theory. It was the ancient Greek theory of humors and miasma. They believed the air itself had been corrupted, possibly by a specific planetary alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345, which they theorized had released noxious vapors from the Earth. So what did they recommend? Don't bathe. Bathing opens the pores to corrupted air. Burn aromatic wood, juniper, rosemary, on street corners to combat the smell of death. Bleed patients who were already dying. Lance the buboes, which only spread the infection into the bloodstream faster. Every rational intervention made things worse, and that realization that their best knowledge was completely useless created a psychological crisis on top of a biological one. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio survived the devastation of Florence, a city that lost perhaps 60% of its population. He left accounts that are still chilling to read today. The terror of contagion was so overwhelming that the most fundamental human bonds broke down entirely. Fathers abandoned sons. Wives left husbands to die alone. The sick were walled up in their homes. The intricate machinery of city life stopped. Laws were ignored because there were no magistrates left to enforce them. Courts closed. Bakeries stopped baking. The familiar sounds of urban life, carts, shouting merchants, construction, were replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by church bells, until the bell ringers died too. Or authorities banned the bells entirely to stop spreading panic. The dead piled up faster than they could be buried. Churchyards overflowed. Massive plague pits were dug. Trenches where bodies were stacked like timber, layer upon layer, covered with thin dustings of soil. In the 14th century, there was no separation between the physical world and the spiritual one. An event of this magnitude had only one possible explanation. God was angry. The Church, the absolute bedrock of medieval life, faced an impossible test. People flooded into cathedrals, massed together in prayer processions that only accelerated the spread of the pneumonic form of the plague through respiratory contact. When prayers failed, when priests died just as fast as sinners, something broke. The flagellant movement swept across northern Europe. Bands of hundreds of men, dressed in identical robes, moving in organized processions from town to town twice a day, in the public square, stripped to the waist, and flogged themselves with leather scourges tipped with iron spikes, drawing blood, performing public penance, trying to take the sins of the world onto their own flesh and stop God's punishment. They were a terrifying sight, spreading religious hysteria wherever they went. But as the death toll kept climbing, something darker emerged. If God wasn't listening, maybe the devil was behind it. A conspiracy theory took hold, spreading fastest through the Holy Roman Empire and parts of Spain, that Jewish communities were poisoning the wells of Christendom. Pope Clement VI officially condemned the theory. He pointed out, correctly, that Jewish people were dying of the plague just as fast as everyone else. It made no difference. Fueled by centuries of existing anti-Semitism and a desperate primal need to blame someone, anyone, for the unimaginable, horrific pogroms erupted. Entire Jewish communities in Strasbourg, Mainz, Cologne were rounded up, burned alive in houses and town squares. The Black Death didn't just unleash biological horror. It unlocked the worst of human nature. It's easy to think of this as a city story. It wasn't. 90% of medieval Europe's population lived in the countryside, and the plague followed them there, carried by refugees fleeing the cities, by itinerant traders, by people who had no idea they were already dying. The devastation in rural areas was slower, but in some ways more complete. Thousands of small villages, whose names are now lost to history, were simply wiped out, abandoned, reclaimed by forest and field. The manorial system, which depended entirely on a steady supply of peasant labor, ground to a halt. Chronicles from the time describe eerie rural scenes, harvests rotting in the fields with no one to bring them in, herds of sheep and cattle wandering aimlessly across the landscape, turning feral, dying of neglect because every shepherd was dead. Wolves, emboldened by the absence of humans, began moving closer to the remaining settlements. The carefully managed medieval landscape was reverting to wilderness. By 1350, the plague had reached the northern edges of the continent. Scotland, Scandinavia, even the small Norse settlements of Greenland, which it effectively finished off entirely. It had burned through the entire continent, from the warm Mediterranean to the frozen north. By 1351, the first catastrophic wave began to burn itself out. The bacterium had simply run out of easily accessible victims. The fog lifted, slowly, painfully, revealing a continent that looked roughly the same, but was fundamentally, permanently different. The death toll will never be known with certainty. Modern historians estimate somewhere between 75 and 200 million people died across Eurasia and North Africa. In Europe alone, perhaps half the population. Gone in less than 5 years. The immediate aftermath was economic chaos and runaway inflation. Supply chains had collapsed, trade networks had broken, entire industries had vanished overnight. But then something remarkable happened. The massive depopulation created a severe labor shortage, and for the first time in centuries, the peasant held the power. Lords who needed their land worked had to compete for workers. Wages went up, conditions improved. The rigid structures of serfdom, which had held for generations, cracked, and in many places eventually broke. Historians call it the golden age of the laborer, born entirely from catastrophe. The psychological scars ran just as deep as the economic ones. Art became obsessed with death. The dance macabre, the dance of death, became one of the dominant cultural motifs of the age. Skeletons leading kings, popes, merchants, and peasants alike in an endless procession toward the grave. A constant, unavoidable reminder that death made no distinctions. The Black Death was the greatest single trauma Western civilization had ever endured. It shattered the optimism of the High Middle Ages. It proved, beyond any argument, how fragile human systems were against the indifferent power of nature. The society that rebuilt itself on the other side was more skeptical, more questioning, more willing to challenge authority, ecclesiastical, political, intellectual. The path that leads to the Renaissance, to the Reformation, to the modern world, runs directly through those plague pits. For centuries, the Black Death felt like a distant medieval nightmare, something safely confined to the history books. But empty streets, locked homes, fear of the air itself, supply chains failing, a desperate search for someone to blame. Does that really sound like ancient history? Or does it feel uncomfortably, unsettlingly familiar? The plague was a test of civilization, of how humans respond when the systems they trust completely break down, when the experts have no answers, and when fear becomes more contagious than the disease itself. And tests, as history keeps demonstrating, have a way of repeating. If this story stayed with you, if some part of it felt closer than it should, that's exactly what history is supposed to do. Thank you for watching all the way through. It genuinely means everything. If this was worth your time, leave a like. It helps more people find stories like this one. Subscribe if you want to keep exploring the moments that shaped the world we're living in right now. And drop a comment. Which story do you want us to tell next? Because the next chapter of history we open might be closer to the present than you expect.
I don't think you'll be able to click on the next video before time runs out.